served as an outlet for people to express themselves over an array of cultural topics such as politics, sexuality, and religion. Ultimately, the driving force in the creativity of musicians has been the culture they found themselves surrounded by. Not only does music allow artists the freedom of expression, it also gives those who consume it a means to which they can associate with, an opportunity they may never receive anywhere else. In some cases, it provides the listener with an escape from whatever reality they must face. Music has both influenced and been affected by culture and has an undeniable power to shape humanity. In order to understand why there's been a relationship between culture and music, it is important to first understand the human nature behind the relationship. One of the greatest characteristics of music is its ability to bring independent cultures together while at the same time creating new ones. Through music, humans have been able to express themselves, whether it be through creation or consumption. Music has allowed people to form identities that otherwise would not exist without it. Now, to understand how music and culture affect each other, it is necessary to understand how the music industry came about and why it's significant. In the late 19th century, the world was introduced to the radio. Paired with newer inventions in transportation, such as the completion of transcontinental railroads, the radio served as a catalyst for the evolution of music in the modern world. Instead of having to hear music solely through live performances, people were now free to enjoy music right where they were. Nevertheless, to do so, music had to be recorded. Recording music fed into the new idea that music was something that could be bought, sold, and owned, rather than simply a social behavior that is experienced. Naturally, like most things in America, capitalism quickly grabbed hold of music and never let go. The sudden monetization of music, paired with the rapid evolution of technology, opened up creative pathways artists never had. Artists finally had new incentives, both monetary and creative-wise, to expand horizons and create better music. Thus, the music industry was born. When culture truly began to impact music, some of the greatest contributing factors were in relation to location, and more specifically, migration. This idea is embodied by the migration of African Americans living in the Mississippi Delta to northern cities. Mississippi Delta is often referred to as the birthplace of the blues, blues meaning a genre of music. When these communities living in the Mississippi Delta moved to cities such as Chicago, they took the music of the blues with them. The new urban settings of these cities were a complete change from the rural environments they'd been used to. These new settings, in turn, influenced the way artists made their music. One of the greatest examples of this is reflected in the music of Muddy Waters. Waters migrated from Mississippi to Chicago in the 1940s and began playing music in clubs. However, the loud nature of these clubs made it difficult for Waters to have his music heard. As a result, Waters combined his previous knowledge in Delta blues with an electric guitar and amplifier, both at which at the time were relatively new concepts. Through his actions, Waters was able to reconstruct the entire blues genre and demonstrated how the culture one is surrounded by can cause innovations and improvements in music. As the world of music were rapidly evolving, so was youth culture. After World War II, America saw a prosperous economy which introduced a middle class. As a result, American youth was granted freedoms and opportunities not granted to past generations. Of these freedoms, financial autonomy was one of the greatest. American youth also used their freedom to explore newer music such as blues and rock, bringing these genres into extreme popularity. Upon recognizing the increased interest in these genres, record companies began marketing towards younger audiences and intended to make as much money as possible. By the end of the 50s, record sales increased nearly $400 million. To put that in perspective, that's worth roughly $4 billion in today's economy. Attempting to enter the progressively lucrative industry, radio personalities and television hosts turned to their respective platforms in order to appeal to youth culture. The most prominent of these efforts came from a man named Dick Clark in his creation of the show American Bandstand. American Bandstand featured a group of teenagers who would dance to whichever records were popular that week. Shows such as American Bandstand became extremely popular and efficient in terms of promoting new music and artists. In response, record labels and producers began to create and push out artists who were lured to a teenage audience. Singers such as Fabian were created to be the quintessential image to attract teenagers and make music that appealed directly to their taste. Unfortunately, through the action of these record labels and companies, music was beginning to lose what gave it its initial value: creativity. Creativity is defined in two parts: originality and effectiveness. The effectiveness was there in the sense that a considerable amount of revenue was being brought in, but there was a complete lack of originality. However, later decades would fortunately see a break from these patterns with the rise of rock music. In the 60s and 70s, rock music exploded into popularity. Bands such as the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and the Doors all saw extreme success worldwide. However, what truly defined rock music was actually its lack of definition. The term rock music acts as an umbrella term for a variety of different musical forms that would later on evolve into genres such as metal or punk. Of these different genres, pop rock of the 70s embodied the effects culture can have on music. Pop rock was essentially music that is created to dominate charts and bring in revenue, but at the same time remain genuine in creativity. Pop rock is greatly exemplified in the music of David Bowie and Alice Cooper. Both these artists were extremely successful in the music industry, but still primarily focused on making original and creative albums instead of just focusing on singles. Pop rock is also defined by an extremely diverse audience in terms of class, background, education, occupation, and gender. As previously mentioned, music has the ability to create entirely new subcultures that transcend barriers and bring together demographics. Music of the 70s embodied this idea altogether. The relationship between music and culture is not one-sided, meaning that music also has the power to influence culture. In the 60s and 70s, the concept of a rock star came into existence. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, and Janis Joplin all served as prominent examples of this concept. Audiences began to idolize and soon imitated these rock stars. These imitations covered a wide array of topics such as fashion, political views, and even in the creation of newer music later on. Of these imitations, open and unapologetic drug use is one of the most prevalent. Musical artists started to include references to drugs as well as their effects being shown in their music. For example, many are led to believe Jimi Hendrix's song Purple Haze is actually about a strain of marijuana. Music from bands such as the Grateful Dead and even later music from the Beatles reflected their drug use. Over time, the audiences of these artists and bands applied the same techniques when it came to drug consumption. In the course of time, music had created its own drug culture, a culture that's lasted through the decades. One of the most significant examples of how music affects culture can be seen at the infamous Woodstock Festival in 1969. Woodstock was a musical festival that took place over 3 days and featured bands and artists such as The Who, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Santana. Originally, there was supposed to be an attendance of only 50,000, but eventually grew to nearly 500,000. Psychedelic and mind-altering drugs were common in this group of people and the musicians they were traveling to perform. As a result, the majority of people at the festival were under the influence of some sort of drug. However, despite this rampant drug use, Woodstock represented what the ideal vision of what music should be. Tensions in America were rising with politics, civil rights, and the Vietnam War. The Woodstock Festival unified a younger generation, attempting to escape from the reality. Nevertheless, the festival and its music allowed them to realize that they had the power to change the world. Despite Woodstock only lasting 3 days, the music and unity defined a generation and gave them a voice they never had. For one of the first times, the views younger generations had on war, civil rights, and politics were given legitimate representation. Woodstock represented how the music and culture of younger generations had the potential to create historical and political landmarks. Unfortunately, popular music was never well received in Christian communities. Music from bands such as Black Sabbath sought to worship Satan. Records from the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and Elvis Presley were reversed and twisted in order to hear demonic messages. For many years, Christian music was divided from popular and secular music. Secular meaning artists had the freedom to express their beliefs and lifestyles without fear of being ridiculed by things such as religious presence. However, in the 90s, Christian musicians and artists decided to deviate from typical Christian behavior and made attempts to break into secular music. To do so, these artists began creating music that would appeal to more mainstream audiences rather than hymns and traditional Christian music, in hopes that their music will be played on secular radio stations. In turn, these artists hoped their efforts would bring Christian messages into popularity. As a result, contemporary Christian music was created. For reference, bands such as Casting Crowns are what would be considered contemporary Christian music. This new genre of music represented the stance Christians need to take in regards to music. Christians need to understand that music and its ability to create and shape identities is a key component of culture. Nevertheless, Christians have still fallen short in recent years since the creation of contemporary Christian music. Since the genre's creation, one of the most common critiques is the lack of originality. Many people complain that almost all Christian music sounds the same, an argument I would have to say I agree with. Another place in which Christian music falls short is who they prioritize as their audience. Christian music is very rarely heard outside of Christian settings, churches, Christian radio stations, and generally any Christian event. There's a noticeable lack of Christian music in any secular environment. This occurrence is partly due to how Christian music is received by those considered secular. However, the greatest reason there's such a significant divide is due to Christians making little to no effort to have their music heard outside of typical religious settings. One way Christians can improve their behavior when it comes to music is to turn to God's Word. In Acts 16, 25 through 34, music is shown to be a way in which Christians can spread the gospel. In summary, in these verses, Peter and Silas have been in prison. While in the prison, to sing and make music in order to worship the Lord. By doing so, they are able to gain the attention of the other prisoners. Later, an earthquake occurs and destroys the prison, granting Peter, Silas, and the other prisoners a chance to escape. Upon realizing what has happened, the jailer attempts suicide, but is saved when Peter calls out to him to let him know they are still there. Towards the end of the passage, it is revealed that Peter and Silas eventually lead the jailer and his entire family to Christ. Christians can do better when it comes to using music for God's glory. When it comes to a lack of creativity, Christians should try and branch into other genres. Additionally, I believe another way to employ more originality is to have Christian artists who do not focus entirely on repeating the same biblical messages in their songs. Instead, those artists should have the freedom to create music that isn't worship, while at the same time not straying from biblical principles and making music involving secular worldviews. A prominent example of this idea can be seen with the music of country artist Brent Cobb. This past January, Cobb released an album called And Now Let's Turn the Page. What is unique about this album is that Cobb did not change his style of music in order to deliver his Christian messages. Instead, he continued to make the same type of music as his previous albums. In regards to the problem about Christian music having a strict audience, Christians should look to learn from the actions of Paul and Silas in Acts 16. The two men had already been in prison for showing their faith publicly, yet in the face of rejection, they still continued to spread the gospel through the use of music. They were able to reach a group of people who had never heard the word of God and likely would never have the chance again. Christian musicians and artists need to learn from the actions of Paul and Silas. They must know that in the face of rejection, they need to remain strong in their faith, continue making attempts to reach those who need to hear the word of God and invite them into the kingdom of heaven. Music has always played a major role in my life. Some of my best memories have involved music, whether it be listening to classic rock on the way to baseball tournaments with my dad, or spending countless hours on my guitar learning riffs and solos. Music has been a factor in my overall happiness. Music has grown to become a part of my identity. However, my faith as a Christian is also part of my identity. Over time, I observed how these two parts of my life clash with each other. The music I have grown to love has been rejected and called unbiblical in some cases. The divide created by the tension between the music and my faith has left me searching for a way to take part in one without neglecting the other. I believe that through Christians making better efforts to create unique music and apply themselves to areas outside of general Christian settings, I will be able to do so. Ultimately, Christians need to recognize that music and culture go hand in hand. In rejecting popular music, they also push themselves away from culture. Instead of doing so, Christians should embrace popular music and make it their own. As Christians should not wholly reject culture, but attempt to assimilate into it and bring the messages of God with it.
Awesome. Yeah, I got it over here. All right, so as per our normal practice, I want to open it up to our visitors. If you have any questions or comments for Liam, he is more than willing to take those.
For any reason you just stuck mostly with narcotic use in music versus some other negative things that could be taken?
I felt that that was probably like the most common and was kind of the biggest example that I could have used, and it just kind of acted as like a way for me to introduce newer topics, especially with the Woodstock Festival, because that was probably one of the biggest and probably most well-known things of that festival.
Okay. And are there any, to your point of not popular music not being, quote unquote Christian, but U2 has some roots in Christian, Carrie Underwood.
Right.
That kind of focus in with.
Yeah, when I said that like secular music isn't Christian, I was just focusing more on how that kind of based on the response that kind of rock music received, because I tried to focus more on like the 60s and 70s, because I felt like without that era, music would never be where it is today. And so I was just, and I know that like U2 and bands like that, they do have, you know, Christian backgrounds, but mainly just the focus was on kind of how bands that didn't have these backgrounds, or artists that didn't have these backgrounds, have been criticized.
What's your favorite genre?
Oh gosh, that's hard. I like a lot of the music of the 70s. Like, I like Pink Floyd, but I also like, I mean, I love like metal of the 80s, like Metallica, all those guys.
You play guitar?
I do, yes sir.
One of the things that we had, especially when we started football, we had a stadium, you had this event going on, and you want to play some background music.
Right.
I think you could uniquely appreciate the hand wringing that went on behind the scenes. So what do you play, right? Yeah. So, okay, if you start off with your Christian Rule Book 101, it was, okay, you can't have references to sex, alcohol use, or any lifestyle that we don't like. And try picking a song now, right?
Stuff.
And at the same time, this is a football game, not church service, right? So you've got a very narrow window, and you say, well, wait a minute, there's a song called Boys of Fall. It's about football. Let's play it. Well, wait a minute, it's by Kenny Chesney. Do you take the one step, and this is kind of the point to this, is do you take that one step further and start judging the artist as if you know their walk, right? And then, you know what I'm saying? And then so, well, do you pick that song because Kenny Chesney likes to also sing about drinking? Or do you pick an Elton John song because, well, he's got a different lifestyle than we would approve of, but amazing talent? Do you pick a Michael Jackson, who's, you know,
And his issues.
yeah, his own issues. So yeah, it's interesting because it's so hard to separate the artist from the art. And yeah, man,
And I'll add to that, like part of our conversations, and Liam, maybe you can comment on this. Part of our conversations in this was like you took more of a distinctly historical take on this. Like you're really telling the story of how, because I think there is a story to be told on how music became commodified and turned into something to be bought and sold and all that stuff. And then in your paper, you spent a little bit longer talking about how that took away from how genuine the music was for a lot of people. All that to say, I think there's a bigger story to be told as far as Christians being able to appreciate good art. Like you're saying, like I know a lot of folks that would not want to admit how good of a musician Elton John is because of everything he represents. But at the same time, like one of the things we've been learning this whole class is being able, as Christians, to be honest when, if there's anything, how does that passage go? If there's anything worthy of praise, think on these things. If there's anything that's that's beautiful or that's good or and so on. And so I think there's a bigger conversation behind your paper on how Christians should appreciate good art, good music in this specific instance. So here's a specific question for you. Christians have this unique thing in our music that we're actually worshiping someone in our music, right? Is it, and you kind of halfway answered this, but I'd love to hear more specific thoughts. What does it look like for a Christian to write music that's not explicitly worship music? Because I mean, it's one thing for me to to have a band to go out and write a worship song that's like Mr. Bryan said, like that's not going to be played in a football stadium. It's going to be played in church, and everybody knows it.
Yeah.
What would it look like for a Christian school or for a Christian band, a Christian artist to write a song that can be played as a football team's running out to the game, or that can be played for a teenager that's struggling with whatever, fill in the blank? What does that look like exactly?
Well,
and this is, I understand this is purely your opinion, but like you've earned the right to give your opinion on this, I think.
I think what that looks like is it has to do with kind of like I mentioned, like Christian music, it kind of basically all sounds the same. And before it gets into, I guess if there's one thing I could say is I feel like just more like subliminal messages, like even if it's just like singing about like creation, but not mentioning a creator or like how God created the earth, something like that.
I think we would all agree that music, just any kind that we listen to, takes us somewhere, makes us feel something. So regardless of whether it's a Christian musician or any songwriter, what's the message that you're putting in your mind and your heart? Is it uplifting? Is it does it line up with your beliefs, or does it go against what a Christian should put in their hearts and minds? So I think a Christian artist could definitely stray away from the worship. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be something we can worship our God, but again, you know, that whole saying of junk in, junk out kind of thing, like, what are we listening to? What are we putting into our ears and our minds? You know, that once it's in there, it can't come back out. Once we see something, we can't unsee it. Once we hear something, we can't unhear it. So, yeah, I mean, I loved his topic because it does affect us. I mean, almost all of us have our own genres that we listen to and that we love and that we, the groups that we follow or whatever. But, you know, what is their music putting into us?
Real quick before, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, like, not deviating, not deviating from like Christian worldviews, but like they can't glorify like secular parts of the world, which is what, you know, you see in most music.
Yeah, I think there's a really big missed opportunity for, you know, we've talked about in here, it's like technology largely works the same regardless of what your worldview is. But Christians should be really interested in technology because it leads to human flourishing, right? Music sounds good. If we're honest, it sounds good regardless of what your worldview is. But you're right, the trick is with music, it's carrying a message, right? And I think that's what's something that's beautifully unique about music. That's what's so intriguing about the whole thing, right? Music as a subject in of itself. But I think there's a big missed opportunity for Christians to be able to express an underlying biblical view of things, but at the same time, an artistically beautiful way of looking at things. So that's why I'm really intrigued in it. Before we open it up to students real quick, let me ask you this: what's the 5-year plan for this? Are you looking to do something musical in college or in the future or so on?
I don't know about doing anything within the college, but it's still going to stay in my life.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, like, I mean, I'll take my guitar with me wherever I go.
Right.
And, like, I might even, like, record music just on my own, just kind of see what happens with it. But I don't know if I'll make it a career or study in college, but it's always just going to be a part of who I am.
Yeah, that's another cool thing about it is it's once you get music in your blood, it's never gonna, you know, it doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. All right, classmates, starting with.
I was going to ask if I could add on to something that.
Yeah, go for it.
Said. When you asked about Christians being in, like, what does it look like for them to create music that's not gossipy but keeping the Christian balance? I think it would build on what he said about differentiating between the art and the artist. I think that it's having this creative basically way of doing your music that's so good that it forces people that this is something that they need to listen to. Like Elton John, at his time of creating his music, everyone loved his music to the point that even though it wasn't as socially acceptable, his lifestyle, people still came to his music and took an interest in his life because of how good he was. It's the same theory that Christians need to have that type of music, be able to be that passionate about it, but still maintaining this Christian lifestyle that people start looking deeper, like, all right, what's the man behind this music? That they finally start to want to copy their lifestyle. That's where Christian.
Yeah, I'll say I've been to 4 Elton John concerts because I am a pianist, and anybody who writes, I mean, and most of y'all know, a lot of people don't write their own music nowadays. got somebody else writing it, and so for somebody who writes their own music and plays like that and performs like that, of course, I don't condone the lifestyle at all, but just to go to respect the musician, the musicianship that comes out on that stage. Yeah, it's amazing.
Cool. Any other questions, comments, or anything? Awesome.
Quick add-on.
Yes, sir.
You know, the part of our conversations too is this idea that God gives all good gifts,
Mm-hmm.
right? So someone with that kind of talent, that was a gift from God. He may not acknowledge it, but it's still, I clearly don't have any of those gifts. I know, so you know what I'm saying? So when someone has a gift and you don't have it, you kind of know, wow, that's special what that person has. And yeah, so in a way, you have to realize that while the sinner is expressing himself, all of us are sinners. It still came from, the talent came from God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Cool. Thank you, Liam.